Good afternoon. I want to talk a little bit more today about some things that exist in some of the amendments to the U.S. Constitution. One amendment that I do want to mention at this point is the Fifth Amendment, which deals with eminent domain. And so, what is this amendment about? Let's see here. Basically, it allows the government to take private property for public use after paying just compensation. Now, there are two or three key words here. One is take. Another one is public use. And another phrase is just compensation. There is a case that I do want to mention at this point, which is about the Fifth Amendment, and it's become a very famous 2005 U.S. Supreme Court case that we do need to discuss while we talk about the Fifth Amendment and eminent domain. So, take a look at this picture of a little pink house. And there's actually been a book written about this house. Also, I think a movie may be coming out about this house. So, what's the issue here? Well, it's someone named Suzette Kelo who bought this house. She was a nurse. It was in a working class type neighborhood. She fixed it up. The cool thing about this house was it had a view of the water. It was in a small city in Connecticut, New London, and unfortunately in that city, unemployment rates were high, and the city was having financial troubles and things were getting depressed, so the city came up with a plan. Pfizer, a company, a large corporation, said, we'll move there if you will do some development of your city to give us some property that we can develop so that we can have an office building, some nice areas for shopping, restaurants, those types of things near the water. Well, unfortunately for Suzette Kelo, her house was in the middle of the area that would be affected by this. And many other homeowners had this same issue. So Suzette Kelo loved her little pink house, but one day she's coming home from work, she looks, and on the door there's a notice that she has to allow the government to take her private property, her home, for public use, for compensation. Her argument was that this is not a public use. It's definitely a taking. They're taking her house. They're definitely going to pay her something. But her argument was that under the Fifth Amendment and under the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the government cannot take her house for this type of use. In other words, the government was taking her house for private development and calling it public use. So she argued this was not a public use. Now, of course, governments take property all the time. A public use example could be when the government builds or widens a road across your property. If it's going to be a public highway, then that's definitely a public use, and there's no question there. The government does have to pay you for the strip of land that they take from you, but they do have the opportunity to take it. On the other hand, is this public use when it's for private development? Well, this went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they said yes. They said public use means common good. The state can take resources, according to the Supreme Court, they can take private resources for anything that is good for the public at large, even private development. And the government had argued that they would get more property taxes if better houses and better buildings were built on this property, and that employment would be better. Unemployment rates would go down, and so they considered this something that would be good for New London, Connecticut, and therefore that was their argument. The Supreme Court bought it. The government won. Suzette Kelo lost. Her house was destroyed then. Unfortunately, after that, really the development never took off. I don't believe Pfizer ever came. And unfortunately, things just didn't work out. But Suzette Kelo and many other homeowners who loved their homes did lose their homes. So again, let's take a look at the slideshow. Fifth Amendment allows the government to take private property for public use after paying just compensation. So, Kelo case is about public use. Also, what is a taking? Let's just imagine for a moment that you own a piece of property that might be zoned by the government as a commercial piece of property. And suppose this is a vacant piece of property, but you feel strongly that you'll be able to sell it to someone who wants to build a large office building on it. So it's very valuable. If the government rezones that while it's vacant and changes the zoning to residential, suddenly that piece of property may have gone down in value quite a bit. It may go from, let's just say, a piece of property worth $200,000 to a piece of property worth $30,000. You're not going to be happy as a landowner, but typically that is not going to be considered a taking as long as the property is for some kind of use still, and it can still be used, just not for as much money as it could have been used before the zoning. So the government does not have to pay you just compensation if they rezone your land, unless they make it completely useless land. But if they rezone it and just change the use to something maybe less valuable, that's not going to allow you to get just compensation. Of course, if they do take your whole piece of property or they take a strip out to build a road, that is a taking. Just compensation is a clause that's in there, and that may be something that has to be decided by a court after testimony by appraisers if the parties can't agree with the government. And we have talked about the Kelo case, and that was the question. Is it public use? And the court said yes. All right. Another amendment that I do want to mention also includes due process, and that's the 14th Amendment. Now, let's talk about due process for a moment. This states that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States or deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, what are we talking about here? Well, due process is important in many contexts. For example, in litigation, the defendant, if they're being sued, has the right to get notice of the lawsuit and has the right to have a chance to be heard by the appropriate court with jurisdiction. So that's one type of due process. Due process can also be broader to just say that certain basic rights should not be deprived, or that citizens should not be deprived of certain basic fundamental rights. And so due process can be pretty broad there. Now there's another part of the 14th Amendment that I want to mention here. Again, no state. We're not talking about your boss. We're talking about no state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So, any law that does that will be deemed unconstitutional and invalid. So, due process of law. This prevents governmental bodies from acting in a manner that is arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable. Now, there's something called procedural due process. That involves cases regarding whether proper notice was given, a proper hearing was conducted, and that kind of thing. Also, there can be some decency type reading of the due process clause, which would just say that governing principles of liberty and justice should prevail. So, due process clause in the 14th Amendment has been used to incorporate the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, which deal with Congress, the federal government, and it makes those Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, also applicable to the states, and that's the incorporation doctrine. Now, where do I want to go next? Well, the 14th Amendment also includes equal protection of the law. This means that persons who are similarly situated must be treated the same under the law. So, again, I'll say it again, persons similarly situated must be treated the same under the law. Now, one example of equal protection that I have seen is a case where a government makes a law that says that topless female dancing establishments must be only in certain locations, and if you're not in those locations, you'd have to move to those locations if you own an establishment that features topless female dancing. And the reason the government came up with that law was they had done a study that said that topless female dancing in a neighborhood had a relationship to increased crime. So that was the general idea behind that law. They had also looked at studies about male topless dancing, and apparently that did not increase crime in neighborhoods. And so the new law that was written by the government only targeted female topless dancing. Now, of course, one thing you could be thinking about is First Amendment freedom of speech when you look at that, because dancing can be a form of expression. Although remember that governments can't completely shut down speech as long as it's not obscene or defamation or some exception, but they can regulate where the speech can occur. So this did not violate the First Amendment. But the other argument in that case was about equal protection. Why are we treating male topless dancers differently from female topless dancers? Is that fair? And there's 3 different possible tests that you could go with here, depending on how you're distinguishing between people. There's 3 tests. One is minimum rationality, strict scrutiny is the other one. And then in between kind of is quasi-strict scrutiny, which is kind of in between minimum and strict. So, lots of different issues can come up where you're treating people differently, classifying them in some way, and then you've got to look at equal protection. But let's go to our example and analyze it here. So how should we decide in the case where male topless dancers are not having to move, but female topless dancing establishments are having to move? Well, first of all, we have to think about what classification it is. So in this case, it's a classification based on gender. So it's right here in the middle. We're treating males and females differently. So the test the court would apply would be, is this law requiring only female topless dancing establishments to move substantially related to an important government interest? The court in that case said, yes, it is substantially related to an important government interest. The government interest that's important is reducing crime. And the study showed that female topless dancing or moving the locations would be substantially related to promoting that interest. So because of that, the female topless dancers and the owners of those establishments that had to move lost their case. Now, you can have other cases. So, for example, you might have a case where you say, we're going to treat people with different weight in different ways. Maybe we're going to tax them differently. Maybe we feel like people who are overweight should pay a higher tax than people who are in a lower rate range. And the question that will be asked is, in that case, which test? And you can see here very clearly it's minimum rationality. And so if this law is rationally connected to a permissible or legitimate government objective, then it's going to pass muster. It's going to be okay. You can see it's much easier to meet the standard here of minimum rationality. Most of these laws are going to pass. If we treat farmers differently in terms of taxes, that's a classification that's going to fall minimum rationality. Or if we have rent controls, but only on gas station buildings, again, if the government can show there's a permissible or legitimate government objective, probably it's going to be passed and not be prohibited by equal protection clause. Gender is kind of in between, harder to prove. Now, if you're going to make a law that is going to treat people of different races, national origin, legitimacy, differently, or you're going to treat people differently about voting, travel, or things like that, then you have got to prove as a government that it's necessary to a compelling state interest, and that's extremely hard to prove. So most of the time, if you're going to treat people of different races differently under the law, that's going to fail or be unconstitutional, but under the Equal Protection Clause. So that's about it for today. I hope that's been helpful, and I will look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.